But everybody, here's Dave Baker, 29th State.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was very, very nice. Welcome. Hello, everybody. Hello, Oskaloosa. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Dave Baker, and I do write the Iowa history blog, The 29th State. You can check me out on Facebook. I also do have a website. I will readily admit I am probably the worst web programmer in the world. But I do enjoy getting out and doing these sorts of events, and so, like Ken said, when he reached out to me during the pandemic and we had an opportunity to visit, he had thrown out the idea of doing one of my live programs here in Oskaloosa, and I'll be frank, I couldn't have been more thrilled. This is a great community. It's a fun community, and I think you'll see here in a little while, I've got my reasons for why I like Oskaloosa and Mahaska County. So, it is Museum Week. Happy Museum Week. And that's a big deal for folks like me because I rely on museums. I rely on museums to get my information. I rely on museums for research materials. And I rely on museums for maps and additional first-person resources, maps, newspapers, things of the like. And we're going to take a look at a number of different things tonight. We'll take a look at some maps, we'll take a look at some pictures, we'll take some readings from newspaper articles, and you'll get kind of a flavor for some of the different communities we're going to talk about. Now, I apologize, I got the lights on in my eyes here, and I'm not... John Jacobs, where are you? I was going to say, I know I saw him come in. Everybody, I have to, real quickly, before we get involved, I need a round of applause for John. I try not to call myself a historian. I am not professionally trained as a historian, although I do work for a state university. Go Cyclones. I always get some mixed responses. But I do enjoy history, and I've always enjoyed history, and I enjoy researching history, so I like to call myself an essayist. John is a historian, in my opinion, and he has done some fantastic work in Mahaska County, collecting Mahaska County resources, and through some of his efforts with the 1984 Mahaska County book, it led me to some great primary sources and some great materials. So, John, I thank you personally. Thank you for all your hard work, and I sure appreciate you, and hopefully everybody else does when we're done with this program as well. So, you're all here to hear about Mahaska County, though, and we're here to talk about the coal mining towns, which is a very, very exciting topic. A little bit about the 29th State. I started out to get people excited about Iowa history, and by the looks of it, I think I'm doing okay, so that's good. Goal number 1 is met. And so when I first started the project, I went out and photographed lots of existing communities and different landmarks in those communities. So I would come into a town like Oskaloosa, and I would take a picture of the courthouse and the gazebo there in the town square and the Chief Mahaska statue and some of the different stores on the square. But the more I got into this project and the more I started working with the different communities, I learned that there's a lot of history that happens outside the communities. Now, some of those happened at farms, and some of those happened at places where there were businesses like coal mines, but there's a whole subset of history that people don't always know about that comes from ghost towns. And ghost towns in Iowa are a little bit of an interesting subject, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But keep that in mind as we get to talking here, because we're going to talk about coal mining towns. But if you know anything about coal mining in Iowa, the last coal mine closed up in 1994, which means that coal mining towns, while already on the way to being a piece of the past, are accelerating even quicker to being a piece of the past. If you think about the railroad access, we don't have railroad access like we did 50 years ago in many of our communities. And so a lot of these small towns, some of which we're going to talk about tonight, may not be around in another 50 years. So it's even more important for me personally to make sure that we record these stories and we share these stories and we keep that history alive. And you'll see a little bit here in a while why that is important to me. So we're going to start off here with this gentleman here. This is Charles Fisher. And Charles Fisher was a Mahaska County resident. Now, you see he's done it up pretty good there. He would not have normally looked like this because he worked in the coal mines. But he's dressed up, well, I'll show you why he's dressed up here in a second. I'm going to have my story. Charles Fisher was born in England. and he immigrated to the United States at the age of 9 months with his parents. Originally, they settled in Pennsylvania, but his father was from the Welsh-English border, and they had coal mines over there. They had mines over there, and so his father knew a little bit about mining. And one thing led to another, and Charles's father's name was Robert Boyd Fisher, ended up in Mahaska County, and he worked first for Oskaloosa Gas. So he worked in the gas company here in 1875. Now, things were not very good for the Fisher family. Charles came home from school at the age of 11 and discovered that his mom had given birth to a sister. Well, I've got 2 kids and I've got a younger brother, so I know kind of how that goes. But the real problem was that they already didn't have enough food to eat. And so Charles, at age 11, decided that he was going to go out and get a job. And his parents were not very happy with that. And in 1956, Charles told about this in an essay that he wrote at the age of 85. And he said, at the age of 11, I came home and a little sister had been born. Things were not good with 7 children to feed. And I told Mother I was going to go to the mine and get a job. Remember, he's 11 years old. Found a job, but the parents would not sign saying I could work. So I signed it myself. Knew Mother would not sign it anyway. I gave it to the boss and was told that I could start work right away. I went home and told Mother. She started to break down and cry. She did not want me to quit school. I started work at the mine and had to walk 2 miles underground. I worked as a trapper for 7 cents an hour and earned $7 in the first month. That was actually pretty good money back then. I then got promoted to a coupler, where I made 10 cents an hour. In 1888, I was promoted to a grip car coupler. Now he's 13 years old. $1.25 a day. Went to work on a Friday, accidentally cut my index finger off. Didn't like losing work, so I was off a day. Next, Brother Harry and I tried digging coal together, but found out we could not work very well, and so we went our separate ways. During this time, I went out and I met people. A few years later, I met a fine lady named Miss Laura Rogers, and we were married. In 1900, our only child was born. The mine then gave out, and I had to go find work. And I got in contact with Mr. Buxton. I worked there 3 to 6 months, and George H. Ramsey hired me as a hoisting engineer. I worked that job for the next 45 years and 6 months. I then left Ramsey and went to work for myself as a general plumber and steam fitter. Owned my own business finally. I started work at Garfield Coal Company, then went to Beacon English Coal Company, Model Coal Company, Economy Coal Company, Des Moines Coal Company, and then lastly, Melcher Coal Company. Now, Charles Fisher is dressed up here not because he was going to a particularly formal event, although he was going to be in front of a lot of people. Obviously, our clothes are a little bit different today than what we would have worn back then in a formal setting. But this is actually what he wore when he was a member of the Evans Band. Now, how many people knew that the town of Evans had a band? They had a city band. Okay, a few people. How many people knew that they actually had 2 bands? Any idea why they had 2 bands? Somebody said it. They had one for the African Americans and one for the whites. They also had 2 bandstands in Evans. You see, Evans, even before Michikenneck, was one of the first places where the McNeil brothers brought in African Americans to help work in the mines. Now, unlike Michikenneck and later Buxton, there was not a whole lot of integration at Evans. Evans was a very rough town. It was a very rowdy town. And if you wanted to go get work, you could go find a good job at Evans. If you wanted to go find entertainment, you could find it at Evans. And if you wanted to find trouble, oh boy, you could find it at Evans. At one point in time, there's an estimate that they had over a dozen saloons in town. And one of those saloons was actually owned by Charles's father, Robert Boyd Fisher. As a matter of fact, his younger brother, George W. Fisher, was born in the back of one of these saloons in Evans. Now, the town of Evans was originally platted as a railroad town. It was not originally platted as a coal town. It's not a company town. We'll talk a little bit more later about what a company town is versus a railroad town. So Evans was platted as a railroad town. It was originally called Elida. And what happened was the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad came through. And then the Des Moines and Keokuk Railroad came through. And when they did that, they formed a junction. And they decided to change the name of the railroad crossing to Knoxville Junction. Now, eventually they went with the name Evans because there was a large landowner named J.D. Evans that lived in the area, and he was very well known in town, and so they changed the name to reflect his stature. Now, Evans was another interesting person. He came to the area very poor and lived a very meager lifestyle, but ended up making a good name for himself in farming. And eventually, he owned several thousand acres. And after he farmed for a few years, then he got into coal mining. We discovered that there was a coal seam in the area. And he became even more wealthy through that process. He worked a lot with the McNeils. Again, we'll talk more about the McNeils later. But Evans was very typical of a railroad town and a mining town. So you had folks that came into the community, and they would take up residence there. And some of them would be permanent, some of them would be more transient, depending on what the mines needed. Now, Evans had a number of stores. They had a blacksmith, they had a hotel, and they also had the coal mining interests with the company store. So it was a little bit of an unusual setup because some of the coal camps would just have a company store. Evans had both company store and privately owned businesses. Now, at its peak, we don't actually know how many people truly lived in Evans because it was never incorporated. It was never considered a city in the state of Iowa in the sense of a mayor and a city council and population count. But some estimates put the population as high as 3,000 residents at its peak. How many people have been to Evans? Can you imagine 3,000 people living in the town of Evans? This is about the only landmark that you will find in Evans. Well, there's other landmarks, arguably, but this is probably the most known building in the community. The former school that's been converted into a church. Now, at one point in time, this is taken from the Midland Map Company Atlas. Put this out in 1905. And you can see here, it's probably a little bit hard to see up on the screen, but there were a number of lots that were platted out, and these were not designed with the mines in mind. These were permanent lots, so these were privately owned. People would move into the community, and they would buy these lots, and they would build houses on them. And so you can see here, at one point in time, it was a very substantial community. If we look at it today from the air, that's what Evans looks like from above, so it's pretty different. So what happened was after World War II, the mines began to play out. Then we had World War I and World War II, the Great Depression sandwiched in the middle there. And so because the mining began to decline, miners first moved elsewhere, and then miners took jobs elsewhere doing other things. And so the population decreased rather rapidly. And so it would have been easy for Evans to become a ghost town, but it didn't. And Evans didn't become a ghost town because it managed to secure with the railroad the ability to repair and do maintenance on the trains. And so it remained a railroad community, really up until the 1950s. Now, over the years, there were a number of interesting people that did come up through Evans. How many folks are familiar with the name of Holland Greenhouses in Des Moines? Yeah, it's an old name in Des Moines. But they actually came from Evans, and that was actually where Albert Holland had his first greenhouse. Who's heard of Theodore Roosevelt? He wasn't from Evans, but he accidentally ended up there one time because he was doing a whistle-stop campaign through southern Iowa and the train ran out of fuel. And so he made an impromptu stop at Evans. Unfortunately, we don't know what he thought of it, but considering how many whistle-stop campaigns he did, he probably wasn't surprised by any of the antics that went on there. As the stories go, with the saloons, there came a fair amount of violence. One of the best stories I came across was that what they would do is they would come out of the saloon drunk and they would shoot at the ground near people's feet just to make them try to dance. They also had a butcher in town who had one leg, and apparently he was very good at entertaining people as well, and quite the dancer. So how do we know about these places? So again, this is a museum week. I put my plug in there at the beginning for museums, which are great resources. But what happens if you can't get to a museum? What happens if it's difficult for you to get to a place where your history is or where the history you're interested in is? There have been a lot of fantastic resources that have come online in the last decade. I started doing this project documenting Iowa communities in 2009. Seems like a lifetime ago. But during that time period, that 13-year time period, I've seen a lot of stuff come online that wasn't available when I first started doing it. And one of the great things that is available is the prevalence of maps. Now, I've done work in a lot of Iowa counties. Haven't quite made it to all 99 yet, but I've gotten close. And I've got to say, Mahaska County has some of the best map resources online of any of them that I've found. I'm not just saying that. If you go out to the Library of Congress website and type in Mahaska County, you're going to be delighted. Because there are a number of very high-quality maps that are out there, and they're free for the public to use. And so we're going to use a couple of those tonight just sort of to illustrate different things. And so the first one I've got up here, this is 1895 map of Mahaska County. And this is a Library of Congress map. And the other one we're going to take a look at periodically is this one here, which is by the Midland Map Company. The Midland Map Company, it's nice because in addition to having a county-wide map, they also have the individual communities. So we get a sense of what the towns would have looked like in terms of how they were laid out and things like that. Now, there are a number of other great map resources out there. The A.T. Andreas Atlas is a fine resource. It's from 1875. It actually doesn't capture a whole lot of the mining towns because in 1875, there was coal mining in Mahaska County, but it wasn't as prevalent as it would be 25 years later. Now, if we were to take a grouping of all the maps and all the newspapers and everything and try to come up with every community that ever existed in Mahaska County, we'd have quite a list. Now, there was a group of us that met over at Nelson Pioneer Farm about a year and a half ago now. I can't remember exactly how long it's been. And we attempted to lay all of the communities out in Mahaska County. And this is, I think there were 83 of them is what we came up with. It gets a little bit tricky because some of them have multiple names, i.e. Elida, Evans, Knoxville Junction, Aneska, Rose Hill. Just a few of them there that I can think of off the top of my head there. Durfee and Rex, we'll talk about that one here in a little while. Auburn, Harrisburg. So there's a number of communities that had multiple names on there. And sometimes what you find is that the post office would have one name, the railroad would have another name. Sometimes they would be the same name and the county would have a third name. It's entirely possible that in some cases you may have 3 names for one place. And so it does get to be a little bit confusing. In addition to that, a number of the mines shared names. So for example, when we talk about Carbonado here in a little while, Carbonado was the site of one of the Excelsior mines. Well, Excelsior was also its own post office. And it was a post office that was south of Oskaloosa, but Carbonado mines were north of Oskaloosa. So that gets to be confusing too. And then we have names that show up other places. So for example, Mahaska County has a White City, which we'll be talking about in a little while. Monroe County also has a White City. And we see that actually quite a bit. And so sometimes it gets very confusing if you're trying to do like genealogical research because you might come up with the same names multiple times, but they may be 2 different places. It's conceivable you might have somebody that worked in the mines in White City, Mahaska in your family, and also White City, Monroe in your family. Because the 2 of them were not that far apart. Now, obviously we don't have time to talk about every single one of these tonight. We'd be here until probably 3 in the morning. So we're going to take a small sampling. We're going to talk about 12 of them today and explore some of the different facts about them and what made them unique. And so really what you have to bear in mind is not every one of these was a railroad community or a mining community, but every one of them was impacted by railroads and minings in some capacity, some much more than others. Some of these places were very little more than just a rural post office. For example, one of the ones that comes to mind is Flint. Flint was a very small area. It had a rural post office. Ferry was another one. Ferry was down by Evelyn Bridge. Flint was up in the northern part of the county. And so some of these places were very short-lived. Some of them really were not much for community. They were just kind of a rural post office. And so that gets to be, again, a little bit confusing when we're trying to break this up. Okay, so let's get into the coal mining stuff. So, Beacon, obviously not a ghost town. Some of you might argue with me on that, but I'm going to stand by my opinion that Beacon is not a ghost town. Beacon is very important, though, when we talk about coal mining in Mahaska County. Why? Well, it was one of the earliest places that coal was regularly mined. Now, coal was found actually in 1843 in Iowa, but at the time in 1843, there wasn't a whole lot of use for coal in Iowa because the railroad had not come through yet. And so does anybody know who the primary user of coal was before the Civil War in Iowa? Who used coal? Blacksmiths. Blacksmiths used coal, but they didn't use a whole lot of it, so having a big mining operation was not practical. And so people knew about coal. They knew that Mahaska County had coal, but it really wasn't until after the Civil War and the railroad came through that it began to gain an interest. Now, one of the most important people in the early part of Mahaska County history was a gentleman named Benny Root. And Root was another gentleman who came to Iowa. He actually came from Ohio, and who was dirt poor. And he started off with next to nothing, and he originally came to Oskaloosa. Now, we don't exactly know what happened, but somebody or something in Oskaloosa made him angry. And so he left town, and he ended up moving out west of the community, and that's where the town of Beacon was eventually laid out by him. And so when Roop moved out there, his original goal was he wanted to build a mill. And so he did that. He built a mill, and it was very, very successful. And then the next thing he did was what we would logically expect somebody to do after they build a mill, is he built a distillery, because that's what you do next, right? Certainly got people interested in coming to his mill. Between those two enterprises, he made a fortune. The only problem was he was looking for some alternative power. And so he ended up getting into the coal interests and ended up becoming quite wealthy from coal as well. And eventually when the railroad came through, the railroad actually put up a stop in Beacon before it put up a stop in Oskaloosa. The residents of Oskaloosa were not very happy with that. I imagine that Mr. Roop was probably pretty pleased that they weren't happy with that, given that information. Now, as I said, Beacon obviously is not a ghost town. When we talk about ghost towns, this is the one that everybody thinks of, right? If I was to say, throw out a ghost town in Iowa, how many people would have said Buxton off the top of their head? Yeah, everybody does. We're not talking about Buxton tonight. You don't have to talk about Buxton, go talk to Rochelle Chase. No, actually, I love Buxton. Buxton's a fascinating community. It's a wonderful, wonderful history. There's a lot of perspective to the history. There's different sides of it. Depending on who you talk to, you're going to get a different version of it. And none of them are necessarily incorrect. It's a lot of how the perceptions are and how things were written and what sources you're using. Because the reporters that came from Buxton and ended up at the Bystander in Des Moines tended to write very positive pieces about Buxton and the Buxton community. If you look at what people up in like Fort Dodge and Webster City wrote about Buxton, it's not quite so hot. Now, most people, when they think of what a ghost town would look like or an abandoned mining town, how many people would think this? What comes to mind when you think of an abandoned mining town? Building falling down, right? I mean, that's what I think of. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go out to Arizona. And this is an old gold mining community called Haines, Arizona. Haines, Arizona is now a ghost town, a.k.a. a tourist town. And just the kind of thing that I go for when I'm on vacation. It drives my wife nuts. But Haines, Arizona is basically one of those places where you come into and they've got the old cars parked out there and they've got the buildings that are falling apart. You can stick your head in there and hope that something doesn't land on it. You're lucky you can even poke down into the mine shaft and find a few little flakes of gold. It's a fun place to go visit. Now, unfortunately, this is mostly what ghost towns look like in Iowa. And I know this for a fact because I have photographed a lot of them. And you have no idea how many times I've driven out into the middle of God knows where and found that this is all I get to take a picture of. My wife goes, "Why do you do this?" I don't know. It's an obsession. So, ghost towns in Iowa are kind of an interesting thing because, unlike out in the West, we have things like derechos and snowstorms and tornadoes. And guess what does not do favors to old wooden buildings? That kind of weather. Now in Haines, Arizona, it's pretty much protected by the mountains, so you're not going to get that kind of wild weather typically, and so that allows for their preservation on there. So most of what we have in Iowa, unfortunately, looks like this. Now this is the area that was once Mahaska. Now, who knows where this is at? Who's driven by this probably 100 times? Yeah. If you've driven between Oskaloosa and Eddyville, you've driven past it. You probably didn't even realize it. Now, Mahaska was primarily on the east side of what is now 63. Part of it did extend over on the west side. And there is a cemetery on the west side. I have not had a chance to get access, but eventually I'm going to get up there. But I went and knocked on doors last summer and didn't have a whole lot of luck, but we're going to make it happen. And Mahaska is one of the earliest, it's not the earliest, but it's one of the earliest examples of a community that was set up exactly for the purpose of mining. And so 1874 was when this community was founded, and it was founded by a couple of gentlemen named McNeil. Now there was Wilbur McNeil, and there was Hobart McNeil. And this took me a while to get this figured out here because I've got 2 kids and I can keep them straight. Trying to keep somebody else's kids straight is a whole other matter. But the McNeils, they were sons of a preacher, of a deacon, and Hobart had fought in the Civil War and then became a lawyer. And he originally was a lawyer over in Illinois, and he came to Iowa because he was associated with the gentleman who was the lieutenant governor at the time. Now, originally he settled in Eldora, which is up in Hardin County, and that was where he had his first law practice in Iowa. But through his contact with the governor's office and the lieutenant governor's office, he ended up coming down to Mahaska County and getting involved in the coal mining industry, which was really just starting to take off at the time. And so his brother, he invited over, and the two of them got involved in the process. Now, Mahaska is a very good example of a coal town in the sense of that was its only purpose. So the town existed for the purpose of serving the mines, the mining interests, and to some extent, the miners. Now, what they would do in these towns is they would put up all kinds of essential services. So if you worked in the mines, you could go into the mining town, the company town, you could go to the company doctor. You could go to the company store, you could go to the company pharmacy, you could go to any number of company-owned businesses, and they would take care of your needs. Now this in one hand was really, really good for the miners because it was convenient. As long as they were employed, they had easy access to this stuff. But what happened when they lost their job or when they quit? All those services went away. And so what you find is a lot of these mining communities, they were, on one hand, very successful because they really give people an opportunity. But on the other hand, they were very limiting at the same time because you had very few choices. If you worked in the mines for Consolidated Coal Company at Munchakinnick, you had to buy things at the company store. That was the only place your pay was good. And so it was very limiting in those regards. And so what happened is eventually the miners began to work together and form the unions. And so over time you started seeing these interactions between the unions and the mines. And in some cases there was some pretty interesting cases of strife that happened. Now the McNeils were famous because in order to break the strike, they went down to Virginia, where, I forget which one of them, I think it was Hobart, had attended seminary for a brief period of time, and they brought back African-American workers to work in the mines, sort of as strike breakers. And that was really the first time that you see the African-American miners working in the coal mines of Mahaska County. Now, eventually, Munchakinnick packed up and became portions of Buxton. And it had a number of interesting people that lived in the community. Probably one of the most interesting ones was Hope Armstrong. Hobart Armstrong, not to be confused with Hobart McNeil. Hope Armstrong was born in 1851, and he was orphaned at an early age and adopted by a family in the town. He was an African-American, and he ended up coming to Munchakinnick and became a merchant there. And so he was actually hired by the McNeils to go down and hire African-American workers and convince them to come move to Iowa and work in the mines. He was very, very civic-minded. He helped to create the Monroe County Fairgrounds, was one of his big achievements. And he also worked with Mahaska County Fairgrounds. And so through his contacts as a merchant and as a civic leader, he got to know a lot of people around the state. And over time, he became even more successful. And at one point in time, he was the largest African-American landowner in the entire state of Iowa. And he got a start in Munchakinnick. Now you can take a look here and see. If you imagine here that vertical line there on the right-hand side, on my right-hand side there, that is 63 today. And you can see that the town was laid out. Now, it eventually got much larger than this. At one point in time, it also had several thousand residents before it packed up. And again, many of them moved to Buxton. Now, I told you we weren't going to talk about Buxton tonight, and I'm not going to talk about Buxton. This is what it looks like from the air now, so there's not a whole lot to see. But we can talk about Coopertown. Now, Coopertown, has anybody heard of Coopertown? A few people, okay. Not as well known as Buxton. Well, Coopertown was one of Buxton's suburbs. Yes, Buxton had suburbs. Buxton, you have to remember, was the largest unincorporated community in the entire United States at the time. It may have been the largest ever, I can't remember. But Buxton was very large, and so it had outlying areas. Now, Coopertown is important because it had some different rules in Buxton. One of the things that the McNeil brothers did not like was alcohol. They were not into saloons. They did not want saloons with their mines. They did not want saloons on their property. As you can imagine, miners being miners, hey, you know what, after working in the mines, it's nice to relax with a cool one, right? And so that created a little bit of friction among them. So what happened is Benjamin Franklin Cooper purchased land on the north side of Buxton. And Cooper had been a pharmacist in Munchakinnick. Now, if you know anything about pharmacists in the 1800s, they had access to things that sometimes were off limits, like whiskey. And so being a pharmacist, he had some familiarity with the kind of things that people like. And so when Consolidated Coal moved from Munchakinnick to the Buxton area, he moved with them. And instead of moving and setting up a drugstore inside Buxton limits with the mines, as he had done at Munchakinnick, he set one up across the road on the other side of the street. Now, Iowa was made dry in 1882, but the Supreme Court overturned that and threw the delegation back onto the counties and the municipalities to decide whether or not they were dry. Monroe County at the time was also dry, which is where Buxton would have been located. Guess who wasn't dry? That would have been Mahaska County. And so Coopertown got to be very, very popular with the miners. As you can imagine, it was not very popular with the McNeils. It was never a very large community, though. It was never going to really be sustainable other than merely for entertainment purposes. It had about 20 houses. Other businesses that set up there. There was a grocery store. There was a place called John Wright's Club Room, which is where a lot of the drinking and gambling went on. There were 2 restaurants. There was a blacksmith shop, a tailor, a clothing store, a barber, and a specialty cigar store. That's how you know you've made it big in life, right? They also had an opera house. And one of the things the opera house did was when motion pictures came along, they had motion pictures. So you could go to the opera house and watch a movie, which was a very big novelty at the time. Later on, a gentleman named J.W. Neely, opened a confectionery store, so basically a candy store. And that was obviously popular with the kids, but Neely was also popular because he was part owner of the Buxton Wonders, which was the baseball team that was very popular in town. They had 3 doctors, they had dances, they had roller skating in Coopertown. If you go out there now, there's absolutely nothing left to indicate that there was ever a town there. If you weren't looking for it, you would drive right by it. Well, what happened to it? Well, in addition to mines eventually moving on, which would have probably brought it to its knees eventually, Coopertown had a number of fires, and it had some very serious fires. The first one was in 1907. And what happened was there was a store that sold clothing called Callaway's, and they still had gas lights in there. And the gas lights ignited during the night, and it burned the store down. Now, that would have been pretty bad had it gotten to the rest of town, but in that particular instance, it was just the one building. But it created a gap that never really got filled back in on that. And over time, what happened is that people kind of began to migrate away from the community. Then there was a second fire. Cooper died in 1915, and so there wasn't anybody propping up the town anymore. And then people began moving to Haydock and Bucknell, which were the 2 communities in Monroe County that succeeded Buxton. And so between the fires and the moving of the mines, Coopertown eventually faded into obscurity. Now, what's interesting about it is it was actually one of 3 suburbs on the northern side of Buxton. The other one was founded by Reuben Gaines, who was also a Mutchkinnick. And then there was Haystown. Haystown had about 15 houses. It also had a photography studio, which is kind of interesting. You don't see that a whole lot in some of these mining towns. Now, just north of Coopertown was a large area that was heavily mined. And there were a lot of little mining camps that came and went in short periods of time to the north of Buxton and Coopertown. Forgot to show you this here. This is an advertisement I found in the Iowa State Bystander, which was the African-American newspaper in Des Moines. Western Mercantile was one of the main clothing stores that served that community in Des Moines. And they actually went down and would do clothing sales at Coopertown. So they had a very interesting relationship there with sort of a department store of sorts. But just to the north of Coopertown, a short distance, was White City. And White City was another mining community that at one point in time had about 200 homes. And today, if you drove through the area, you would not, again, know that anything was there. Now, this was the Crescent Coal Company that operated White City. And some of the other mines in the area, there was Mac, was another one of the big ones. The McMillans had that one, not to be confused with McNeil's. But Crescent Coal Company provided the workers, again, with a number of amenities. Dentists, doctors, barber shop, company store, blacksmith. And all of this was designed by W. White, who had created the community in 1902 with the coal company. Now, one of the things that's interesting about White City is that it was not only a mining town, but they really forged relationships with the farmers in the area. Because the mines were going on underground, something had to be going on above the ground. And so a lot of the farmers in this particular area got really well connected with the mining community. And so what you see is a lot of immigrants that move from the mines to the farms in this area. And one of the things that's very interesting about White City is you see that the school also began to integrate the mines and the farms. So White City had its own school district, or had its own school. It was built on the south side of the village and could accommodate up to 175 students. But just a short distance away, there was a township school that served the farms. And what you see is this very interesting mingling of students between the 2 different worlds. And so you have kind of an interesting dichotomy of students that interacted with each other that may not have in other places. Now, White City was not a very long-lasting community. It lasted from about 1902 to 1915, so a little more than a decade in existence. But even after that point in time, people remembered this community because even though it was short-lived, there was such an interaction between folks that was different, and that just stuck in the memory. So actually, when I wrote up a story a while back on White City, I still had people that remembered. It was kind of interesting to read their stories about it. You know, it hasn't existed in over 100 years, but people remember their grandparents talking about it, and in some cases their parents talking about it. The railroad came through White City. It took a sharp turn and went down to Buxton, so it was well connected with Buxton. It was also well connected with Oskaloosa. You can take a look and see here where White City would have been in Jefferson Township. Now, White City may not have been in terms of wild stories like we've seen some of the other mining communities. We reserved that one for Durfee, which was just down the road. Now, when you think of a mining town, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Soot? Dirty? Dirt? What kind of people live in mining communities? Illiterate. Rough. Tough, yes. Now, again, some of those are a little bit stereotypical because there were good families and there were good people that worked in mines and there were a lot of very hard workers. But there were a lot of very interesting characters. And Durfee seems to have attracted a number of these. And, excuse me here. Durfee's kind of an interesting one because, again, it's one of those communities where you see two different names used. So sometimes you see the name Rex. Rex was the name of the post office. Durfee was the name of the actual mining town, the mining camp. It was located in sections 19 and 20 of Jefferson Township and founded also in April of 1902. Rex Fuel Company was the coal mining outfit that supplied it. Now, the Rex Fuel Company was founded by four shareholders who had formerly been involved in coal operations at Cheer, so over in Keokuk County. And they were H.S. Howard, H.L. Spencer, Wilbur Durfee, and Clarence W. Durfee. Now, the Durfees, for some reason that last name, John, it just makes me smile. It's just something about that name. They were from Rhode Island, and they were actually a very prominent family in Rhode Island. But they ended up moving into Iowa and getting involved with the railroad. Now, Clarence Durfee was the father, and he was generally very, very well liked. He was appreciated by his employees, and by most accounts, he was a very good mining supervisor. Now, his son was Wilbur Durfee, I had that backwards. Wilbur was the dad, Clarence was the son, and Clarence was not real well liked. He had a very short temper. Now, I'm going to share with you something here, and I apologize. I'm going to do a little bit of reading just so that I get this right. Because one of the most controversial things that ever happened at Durfee was when an angry employee decided to take a couple pot shots. Interesting things happened at Durfee. An angry employee, an angry former employee, decided to take some pot shots at Clarence. And so we get this little nugget from the Eddyville Tribune this is, I forgot to put the date on there. Early 20th century on here, so I apologize for that. I forgot to put the date on. This is again from the Eddyville Tribune. A shooting at Durfee. A shooting affair occurred at the mining town of Durfee over in Mahaska County, 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon. An objectionable man named Ellis has been discharged by the company. He has accrued work elsewhere but has not moved his family. Saturday, he returned to Durfee and demanded what was due to him, aka his paycheck. The company has a rule to not pay discharged men what is due until they have vacated the company houses. Ellis was very angry and fired at Clarence Durfee. The heavy load of the buckshot tore away a small portion of Durfee's left ear. Durfee returned the fire with his revolver and shot Ellis in each arm. Ellis fled and was captured and lodged at the jail in Oskaloosa. Neither of the wounds are very serious. Okay. Well, that sounds like a mining town for you, right? I mean, that doesn't surprise me. Well, what's interesting is how this story evolves and spins a little bit depending on which newspaper you're reading. So again, that was the Eddyville Tribune. Way up in northern Iowa was the town of Stratford. Who knows what Stratford is? Yeah. Webster County. Hamilton County. Hamilton County. Now, Stratford was another railroad town, and this is how they reported the story. In a shooting affray at Durfee, a mining camp 18 miles southwest of Oskaloosa, Clarence Durfee, son of W.A. Durfee, the mine owner, received serious injuries from a shotgun and narrowly escaped death and his assailant, a Negro, their words not mine, named J.F. Ellis, received a revolver ball in each arm. The shooting occurred in a room filled with men who were waiting for their pay. Again, not my word, their word, the Negro had been discharged from the employ of the company and had been refused his money until he could move his family from the quarters of the company of which he was occupying. This incensed him, and he returned and fired a shotgun at Durfee, tearing away a portion of his right ear and badly burning his face with powder. Durfee returned the shot with a revolver, firing 3 times, 2 of which lodged in Ellis, who was escaping and going towards Oskaloosa. He was then met by officers on the way who, believing his story to be an accident, accounted for his injuries and allowed him to pass. By use of the rural telephones, they were sent back, however, and retracing their steps, captured him while he was looking for the doctor to dress his wounds. Durfee was not badly hurt, but had a very close call for his life. Okay, so none of the wounds are very serious. He had a very close call on his life. Now, I've done programs up in Hamilton County. I've not done a program in Stratford yet, but I did one in Gower, which is just a few miles out there. They're good people. You have to remember, I got my start originally when I was a student at Central College, go Dutch, which means I spent 4 years living in Pella. And I love Pella. I worked for the Pella Historical Company, or Pella Historical Society, rather. That's where I got my idea to start doing this business of driving around taking pictures of towns. But here's the thing about Pella, and God love them and I love them. They're great people up there, but nobody can spin a story like a Dutchman. Here we go. This is the Pella Banners version of it, and I will say that the Pella Weekblad, the Dutch newspaper, also printed a very similar story. Just have some whiskey in here. I'm going to read this from Pella. Reverend George Niemeyer of Pella was instrumental in assisting the capture of a Negro, again their word not mine, and who indulged the pastime of pumping buckshot into his employer at the mining camp of Durfee, 2 miles southeast of Bussy, last Sunday evening. Reverend Niemeyer was driving to Bussy and passed the colored desperado at the Evelyn Bridge. Further on, he met Clarence Durfee, the victim of the murderous attempt, and gave him the information that he had met the fellow. Durfee therefore telephoned the sheriff, who headed the Negro off and effected his capture. The story of the shooting is as follows. Saturday afternoon was the regular day of pay at the mines. Manager Durfee was engaged in paying the employees of the company in the store building. It was very crowded at the time. It appears the man Ellis had been disturbing the elements at the Durfee camp, and his services had been dispensed of. He had secured employment at Bolton. Bolton was just to the west of Beacon. It was another mining town. But he had returned to Durfee to get what was coming to him. He appeared at the pay office while there were other miners receiving their pay and asked for the settlement. Coal companies have a rule that if a man shall leave their employ while he is occupying company house, he shall not receive the amount due until he has vacated the employer's property. Mr. Durfee refused settlement with the Negro on the grounds that he had not left the company's property. Ellis demanded his money in terms more forceful than elegant and left the company offices in a great rage, swearing that he would collect his money coming to him one way or another. He then went away for a shotgun, returning to the office in the coal company. He entered the room, and just what happened next is not entirely clear. Well, it was clear in the other newspaper. Ellis, pointing the shotgun at Durfee, pulled the trigger. The charge went just to the side of Durfee's head. It filled his face full of powder, and shot took off part of his ear. It was a very close call for the man's life. Durfee drew his gun, a 38 caliber revolver, and quickly returned fire, shooting 3 times, of which 2 of them took effect. One entered the fellow through the left arm, passing through the bicep. The other ball entered through the right elbow joint and lodged there. The colored man escaped before the building could be vacated or Durfee could fire more shots. Covered in blood streaming from the wound, it was thought that he was more severely hurt than was actually the case. Great confusion prevailed at the store for a time. He was eventually safely placed in the Mahaska County Jail around 9:30 o'clock. The flesh wound is not at all serious, but the wound in the arm is very, very bad and appears to be very painful. That's Pella for you. Like I said, the Dutch know how to tell a story. Now, we could easily dismiss this and say, oh, that's just an isolated incident, right? One instance where somebody decided to take a pot shot at the vice president of the company. Well, that seems pretty jarring right there. But that wasn't the only dispute that happened at Durfee. We also find that the Gowrie News, again I said I did a program up Gowrie, in 1909 ran a story about Durfee miners near Oskaloosa were in a desperate affray where there was multiple stab wounds. Apparently there were a couple of gentlemen that came out of a crap game and decided to take knives to each other. That also was well reported around the state. And if that wasn't enough, we found another incident from 1905, September of 1905, that was reported also in Hamilton and Webster County, in which case an unidentified and still apparently unidentified assailant attempted to poison the Durfee family with evidences of Paris green, which I believe is arsenic. They poured that down the pump stock into the well water. Fortunately, Durfee's daughter, who happened to be in town, and she noticed that something was off in the water. Thank goodness for her observation, I'm sure. So as you can see here, there were a number of different instances that happened at these mining towns, and some of them got to be quite excitable, and they made newspaper stories clear around the state. And you can see here, again, this is actually from the 1913 Midland Map Company Atlas. Durfee showed up on there. There's nothing to really indicate there was a town there other than the railroad tracks. They've been torn up, and you can see where they once ran. Now, a similar situation where you can't really see much of the town is Lost Creek. And Lost Creek I bring up for another reason altogether. Because unfortunately, with these mining communities, you have to remember that there was no OSHA back then. And so there were a number of instances where people got seriously hurt and or unfortunately got killed. And Lost Creek was one of those places. Now, Lost Creek Coal Company was incorporated as a company, not as a town. It was not an incorporated town, again, in the sense of having a mayor. But it was incorporated as a company in 1894. And this would have been in Harrison Township. I'll bring up the map here for you. I guess I don't. There it is. Nope, that's PK. Okay. But anyway, it was in Harrison Township was where Lost Creek was on there. And what actually happened was it had been started as a mining company in 1890, and the mining firm had gone bankrupt. And there was a gentleman that showed up there. His name was Spencer. He had been actually with Durfee, E.H. Spencer. And he put a bid in for the mine at Lost Creek, and he ended up being the only person that bid on it. And so he ended up getting the whole outfit for about $7,500, which was a lot of money at the time, but he made a whole lot more than that back. At one point in time, the capital stock of Lost Creek coal mine was over $100,000, and that is not in today's money. So it was a very, very profitable enterprise. But in 1902, there was a disaster at the Lost Creek mine. What happened is they were doing some shock discharge, which is what they would do to blast the coal from the wall. And what ended up happening was that there was some gas down in the mines, and there was a huge explosion in the mine. And so what happened was there was this explosion that killed 19 miners in there, and basically caused the mine to collapse in places. And that was something that was very, very concerning, of course, not only for the people who lived in the community and lost loved ones with that, but that also had a toll when it came to the state as well. Because what happened is the state of Iowa looked into that, and they said that, listen, they can't be doing these detonations underground. They can't be doing these shot blasts underground with miners in there. And so that was actually the first instance where the state of Iowa decided that they were going to work with the coal company and they were going to try to improve safety for the workers. And that was a direct result of the mine explosion at Lost Creek. And so after that point in time in 1902, they were no longer allowed to fire shots while other miners were in the shafts. So they had to clear everybody out before they could do that. And so the idea was that they would prevent fatalities on that. And that actually worked out quite well just down the road at PK. Because a short time later, there was an explosion at the PK mine. It was a little bit different set of circumstances. But in that explosion, only 2 people, unfortunately, were killed instead of 19. So it was significantly less carnage than what had happened at Lost Creek. Now, PK was founded by the Whitebreast Coal Company, which had done a lot of work down in Lucas County. And so what had happened was they had come up here to do some speculating and investing. And the 2 gentlemen that ran it, their last names were Phillips and Kepler. P and K. PK. They wanted an easy name to remember. So they platted the mining camp in 1893. It was 126 lots. Had regular streets and alleys. And the company let the miners have each lot rented for $10 a year, which is a pretty good deal for them. Again, it was in 1892. There was the mining explosion. 1902 was the mining explosion at Lost Creek. PK also had its own explosion on there. In 1906, the mines had essentially played out in there. And so what happened was after PK and Lost Creek, the mines played out, is they moved over to the western part of the county, which is where you see the communities of White City and Durfee pop up. You see here PK on the map there. That's what it would look like. That's the platting of the town. Now also on that part of the county was Carbonado. PK was located southeast of Oskaloosa. Carbonado was located northeast of Oskaloosa. And it was laid out about the same time. So if you're noticing a pattern here, a lot of these mining communities came up 1890, 1892, 1896. 1890s was really the golden opportunity to find coal in Mahaska County and really in much of Iowa, central Iowa. Carbonado was laid out by Charles W. Lacey, and the name was picked because, according to him, it meant coalville in Spanish. Actually, technically speaking, it means carbonated in Spanish, but why split hairs on that? They considered the name Shepperton, but Shepperton was a little bit difficult for people to pronounce, so they went with something that was a little bit easier. Whiteman was also suggested, but they rejected that as well, which, if anybody is from Whiteman, that was formed later, that's probably okay. Another name that was considered was Swalmton, which, again, very difficult to pronounce on there. The reasons that some of the names were picked were because of different landowners that were in the area. Frank M. Shepherd, for example, where we get the Shepperton from, was the original landowner that put up the sale to the mining company. And Carbonado had a number of stores. They had a Methodist church. They had a Quaker church there as well. Only coal mining church that I've come across so far that was associated with the Quakers, the Friends Meeting House there. The Welsh also had a Presbyterian church that met in Carbonado as well. It was a very heavily Welsh area. Charles Lighton was the gentleman who had the store. The store was actually built as its own entity, so it was not a true company store. And that store obviously would have supplied a number of materials not only for the farmers, but also would have supplied for the coal miners too. The railroad was the other big industry there. Just about everybody was involved in one industry or the other in one way or another. Obviously, even the farmers had to ship their livestock, and so there was a fair amount of shipping that went on at Carbonado as well. The mines were operated by the Excelsior Coal Company. Again, if you think, well, wait a second, Excelsior, I've heard that name before. In the 1870s, Excelsior was one of the early mining camps in Mahaska County. It was located actually to the south of Oskaloosa. Same company, different location. Again, this is what it would have looked like if you were looking at the plat back in 1890. Now, a similar railroad community, one that was more long-lasting than Carbonado, would have been LaConto. And I found this little interesting newspaper piece that was from the West Des Moines Township News. This is West Des Moines Township, not the town of West Des Moines. That was written in 1900. LaConto, the new town in West Des Moines Township, 7 miles northwest of Eddyville, or 11 miles southwest of Oskaloosa, is a coming metropolis of Iowa. It's been located and will commence with business at once. It is located on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. Okay, I gotta take a slight deviation here. Who's heard of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad? Okay. The Chicago Northwestern Railroad had a subsidiary called the Western Town Lock Company. The Western Town Lock Company is probably the most important business in Iowa that you've never heard of. Maybe arguably one of the most important in the Midwest. So the Western Town Lock Company, what they did was they went behind the railroad, behind the Chicago Northwestern, and they would plat out the towns. And all over Iowa and all over the upper Midwest, we have towns that were created by this railroad. Places that you've probably heard of, like Emmitsburg and, Webster City, kind of. Webster City existed beforehand, but they platted the southern part of it. Stanhope, Stratford, Schleswig, Ricketts, Deep River. They also platted a number of towns that no longer exist, like Botna and Tilton over in Keokuk County. Botna's in Shelby County. And so there are towns all over the state of Iowa and actually all over Nebraska and South Dakota that essentially are sibling towns to LaConto. They were all founded by the same company. And what they did was they extended a branch line from Belle Plaine down to Wet Shear. So the main line of Chicago Northwestern ran through northern Iowa. They extended a branch line that connected up with that route that eventually would go through Webster City, Fort Dodge. They brought that down from Belle Plaine and connected it up to Wet Shear. And the purpose of that was to primarily transport coal. The Chicago Northwestern had gotten in cahoots with the McNeil brothers with Consolidated Coal Company, and they had essentially formed an alliance between them. Eventually, they bought them out. And so the Chicago Northwestern controlled its own coal operations. And so that was obviously very, very profitable to the railroad. Now, at LaConto, what they did was they actually built a coal wash station. And it was the first coal wash station in Iowa. And the reason that was important was if you think about the way coal comes out of the ground, you have to dig it out. So it's dirty, covered in debris and refuse and other minerals. And so they had a coal wash station, and what they would do is they would process the coal there. So you had a more pure, better burning coal that would be better for the railroad. Now, a lot of people think about Iowa coal being high in sulfur, and it was. Compared to other parts of the state, like in Boone County and Dallas County, Mahaska County and Monroe County coal was relative, it still had sulfur in it, but comparatively it was a lower amount. So it made sense to have a coal wash station in this area because they were pulling so much coal out of the ground. It was good quality coal. They could process it, and then the railroad could use it directly. So they essentially cut out a lot of middlemen on that. There were 3 grocery stores. You could get essentially anything you needed at the general stores. They were very, very well stocked. We actually came across some listings of different things that the stores had in some of the old newspaper articles from Eddyville. Stove polish, lamp chimneys, clothing, shoes, yard goods, dry goods, clothing. All those things can be bought in town. I don't know if you've been there recently, but it's kind of hard to imagine buying anything there now. There's not a whole lot to see. One of the more interesting things that I found out is that the town had a funeral establishment for a while, but they went out of business. Which you wouldn't think of a funeral home going out of business. We have to think about it. Funerals at the turn of the century were still largely private affairs. They were conducted in the home a lot of times, in parlors. So a funeral parlor, specifically for that purpose, was a little bit of a revolutionary idea, you could call it, I suppose. But aside from that, there were so many young people in town that there really wasn't a whole lot of demand for it. There was much more demand for the lumber yard, and lumber yard did very, very good business in town. They built a large depot, had a number of trains that passed through daily, both carrying livestock, passengers, and also commodities as well. Okay, we're getting kind of down to the end on time here, so I got to be mindful of that. Again, there's what the original plat would have looked like. A similar town would have been Gibbon, and Gibbon was laid out, again, kind of like Evans. It was a railroad town first. It was not a coal town in the sense of being a company town, but it had a lot of miners that lived there. And Gibbon attracted a large number of Welsh miners. And so there were a lot of Welsh settlers that moved into the area and had a lot of influence. You also had a lot of Swedish settlers in Gibbon. And so a lot of folks that came in and moved into that community were actually looking to establish a little bit more permanence. So while you had miners that lived in town, a lot of people that lived there were there more for the sake of being immigrants and trying to start a new lifestyle. Gibbon was actually the name is actually older than the town itself. It was named for John Gibbon, who was a landowner. But the post office was there as early as 1862, actually. The railroad didn't come along until 1871, and then it took on that name as well. There were a number of stores there. There were a number of privately owned businesses. Again, because it was a railroad town, it was not a company town. There was a union depot. There was a station agent there until 1934. So they still were using the railroad even after World War I and into the Great Depression on there. One of the highlights that I found that people really looked forward to who lived in Gibbon was there was a special train that came up from Eddyville and would bring in bread from the bakery down there. And that was something that people really, really looked forward to. Another thing they looked forward to at Gibbon was, again, because it was a largely immigrant community, they tried to assimilate folks into American traditions and culture. And so they would have big parties in the summertime on the 4th of July. They would have ice cream socials. And then eventually the gentlemen of town decided that they wanted to do a Thanksgiving event. And so they would have annual Thanksgiving events and 4th of July events, as well as traditions like baseball. And so a lot of times these immigrants, these communities like Gibbon, were their first taste of American influence and what we would think of as sort of that all-American branding, the 4th of July and baseball games, things like that. And you can see at one point in time, it was a very, very busy town. There were 2 railroad tracks that went through there, 2 different rail lines that went through. So it was a junction town. There were a number of plats that were laid out on there, a number of residents that called it home. There's maybe about 15 buildings there today. There's not much to see. All of it is another community that was a railroad town first and later became a coal mining town. All of it was designed primarily for shipping agricultural goods, commodities, and livestock. It was founded in 1877 by a civil engineer with the unusual name of Free Tufts. I'm not sure what his mother was thinking on that one, but it was on the Chicago, Rock Island Pacific Railroad. The depot was built in 1877. And began being used in 1877. So it was built and pretty much was put right into immediate use. One of the biggest things that all of it had was it had a telegraph office. And if you think about where all of it is located, if you're familiar with that area, there's not a whole lot around there, even now. And there would be even less around in 1877. So to be able to send a message would have been quite revolutionary at the time. Beacon probably would have been the closest telegraph office, maybe Lighton. I don't even know if they had one. But that would have been quite a jaunt to go get a telegraph. So that was very, very handy to have that there at all of it. They had a general store. General store was used by both the farmers again and the coal miners. They had an implement dealership there as well for the farmers. The gentleman that ran the general store, I kept sitting there going, why does that name sound familiar? Van Spanker. Why is that name familiar? And then it dawned on me, oh yeah, he used to work for the Fellow Historical Society. Van Spanker's store, they got one of those up at the Fellow Historical Society. Actually, all of it had a number of ties to the Dutch community, which is kind of interesting. One of the miners one of the mine owners down there was a gentleman whose last name was Rietveld, which is another very, very Dutch last name. And so you can kind of see the influence on that part of the county that Marion County would have had on that as well. Here's what the plat of all of it would look like. If you look at it from the air today, it looks very similar to this. There's just a lot fewer buildings on there than what it would have been at the turn of the century. All right. Well, we are getting to the end of the evening here, so I do want to kind of wrap things up here. And I want to take us to one last ghost town to talk about this evening. And that would be Fishville. And Fishville is probably one of the more obscure ghost towns in the county. Have you ever heard of Fishville? Okay, a few people. I found out about Fishville in kind of an unusual manner. I'll get back to that in a minute. But one of the things I wanted to do was actually figure out where it was. And so I looked at a number of maps because it wasn't always consistent where it was located. It existed for a very, very brief period of time, and comparatively not much is known about it. So Fishville began as a mining camp, and it was located on a spur of the Rock Island Line. It was 2 miles west of Evans, and it was on a hill. It would have been founded somewhere around 1885, and by 1920 it was completely gone. So completely gone, really, come and gone completely in the space of about 45 years. The post office lasted even less time than that. Fishville only had a post office for about a year and a half. They did have a school that was there for a little period of time, and then that was associated with the township. And then they eventually moved the students to East and West Weaver schools. That's where they went to after that. Now, this area here is where the coal mine would have been located just to the west of Fishville. And I took this picture actually very early on when I was doing the 29th state. I took this picture in the summer of 2009. If you go out there, it's changed very little since then. There's not a lot going on there. But in 2020, during the pandemic, I had an opportunity to connect with the landowner, and I went out there and did a little bit of exploration, just to begin to see where the town was on there. Now, I happen to know that the street that was once along the township has been vacated. So there was a street that ran along the township line, the section line rather, and that street is no longer there. But when I got out in the woods, just to the east of this picture, I was able to find the section pin. And I was able to figure out roughly where the road would have run. And that was important to me because, you can see here, that's where Fishville would have been. A little bit blurry, but it's right down there on the east side of section 12. Fishville is important to me, though, because this here is the death certificate of my great-great-great-grandfather, William Meister, or Wilhelm Meister, as he was known in Germany before he immigrated over and settled in Fishville. And if you look up there, it's a little bit hard to see. His place of death is listed as Fishville, Iowa. Now, in addition to this project, I do a lot of genealogy. And that's maybe the biggest takeaway that I share with people when I do these programs, I do these presentations, is that you need to learn about these communities because otherwise you're going to be doing your research, you're going to be asking questions about your family, you're going to hear people talking about your family, and you're not going to have any idea where any of these places are because some of them don't exist anymore. And Fishville is one that there is no trace of it. I walked for about 3 hours in a very small area of woods, looking down on the ground, trying to see if I could find anything, no foundations. The only sign that I found that there was ever anything there was I found a part of a coal shovel. That was it. The guy let me take it home. That was pretty cool. Should have brought it. I didn't think about that. But in addition to that, in addition to the town itself, we have to remember that towns are people. Towns are an extension of ourselves, right? We put our energy into our community. We put our energy into organizations in our community. Rotary clubs, Masonic lodges, churches, schools, all those different things. We put our time, we put our energy in them. Why? Because they're an extension of ourselves. And so, you have to remember that communities share our mortality. Some of them a lot longer than others. I think Oskaloosa is going to be around for a while. But Evans, I don't think Evans is going to be around maybe another 50 years. Fishville's already gone. I don't know about all of it. But when Evans is gone, the Evans Band is going to just become an obscure footnote in history. And for me, that's a little bit of a problem as well. Because up there is Charles Fisher, the guy we talked about at the very beginning. Down in the corner is his younger brother, Judd Fisher, who again was my great-great-grandfather. And all those gentlemen, not all of them, but most of the gentlemen in the background of that picture are all relatives of mine. This picture, I had the fortune of actually holding the original hard copy at my great-aunt and uncle's house over Memorial Day weekend and taking a picture of it so I could share it with you today. And on the back of it, my great-grandfather wrote down the names of every person in the picture. And having that piece of history and being able to touch that history and connect to it is so important. And so that's why I bring these stories to you. That's why I bring these places to you. It's not about the ghost towns. It's not about the mining companies. It's about the people who live there. And it's about the people that live there that connect to us. How many people in this room have a connection with Mahaska County coal mining? Yeah, I'm seeing most of the hands, a big chunk of hands in here. Me too. And so we're all connected by that. In fact, if we went back far enough, we'd probably find out a few of us are related. I don't know if I want to do it on that route, but we'll always see. But all these places tie into our legacy, tie into our history, and they also tie into our legacies as well. Lyton. Lyton's another coal mining town. Again, it wasn't founded as a coal mining town, but many of them lived there. My great-grandparents both lived at Lyton. They met in Des Moines, but before they met, they both lived in Lyton. My great-grandfather used to talk about how when he would go to work in the coal mines, by this time he was in Marion County, and he used to talk about he would catch a streetcar rather, or a streetcar of sorts, and he would walk to it from Lyton. And he used to talk about these two big houses north of Lyton. Well, I know what those two big houses are. One of them's not there anymore, but the other one still is. And so there's these connections to all these different landmarks. And there's these connections to these places and these people. And so that's what I try to do with the 29th state. It's to encourage people to explore and learn about the state of Iowa. It's to get people excited about Iowa and provide meaningful and productive conversations. So let's build community. Now's a great chance. We're able to get out and interact more than we could a year ago or 2 years ago. Meet your neighbors, talk to them, find out what their heritage is. You're probably going to find out you have more in common with them than what you think. I was so excited to come and give this program tonight because I have these connections to Mahaska County. So thank you very, very much for letting me come and share these stories with you, for sharing my own history with you, and thank you so much for giving time this evening to the community. Because again, the community is what keeps us all together, but it's the individuals that give it life. Ken, thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it greatly. Thank you, Dave. I got to do a quick personal plug here. If you enjoyed this, I am back on my normal speaking schedule. I'm kind of getting back into it after 2 years of really being down. So if you're interested, I will be doing a program next Tuesday night at Peachtree Brewery in Knoxville. We'll be talking about Donnelly Station, which is a railroad station that was located just to the west of Knoxville, that I also have family ties to, but that's the other side of the family. If you're down in southwestern Iowa, I am doing the Lennox Iowa Sesquicentennial, the 4th of July weekend. I'm also doing the Corydon 4th of July event on July 4th. We have a program coming up in Eddyville. I'm going to have to post the date because I don't remember what that is off the top of my head.
I'm not going to be a help to you.
Sorry. There is going to be a program coming up in Eddyville for the museum down there, and there's also going to be a program in Tabor on the Underground Railroad coming up this fall. So some great opportunities, and I also have to put a plug in that I am finally working on the book that I set out to do in 2009. It is not about ghost towns, but it is about all the incorporated towns of the center 33 counties in the state of Iowa, including Mahaska. So.
All right. Well, another round of applause for Dave Baker.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
I'd really also like to thank George Daily for making themselves available for this. Such a great venue. Oskaloosa's lucky to have this. Thanks again to my wife. She's back there filming and helping keep me corralled. So everybody have a safe night. Enjoy yourselves. Go enjoy the weather. And we'll hopefully have Dave back for another program.
Thank you so much, everybody.